good afternoon, and actually good morning for some of you dialing in from the States. And thank you for joining. This is a particularly exciting session on Grid 2.0. Really, what we view is kind of what is the potential for the grid over the next couple of years. So, hosting today's session will be Louis and myself. Louis, for those of you who don't know him, he is running our e-mobility and also AI business, and grid is very, very central to that. So you'll be hearing more from Louis as we go through today's proceedings. So this session is very much in a kind of sequence with other webinars and investor briefings we've had with, I'm sure some of you have been on, whether it's on AI we did last January, or e-mobility, EV charging, long duration energy storage, and so on. So, and by the way, for those of you interested, we do have a electrochemical LDES one coming up in April. So you'll be hearing about us about that from us very shortly. So anyway, let's get down to it. In terms of just how we're going to run today, from ourselves, just a quick 5 to 10 minutes on our overview of the sector, and then I'm going to open it up to our panelists to introduce themselves, their companies, and then we can get down into the guts of a great panel discussion. And we should be, to a point about just over an hour today. So let's get going. Just a couple of big sort of sound bites from us. The investment that's going to be required for the grid is, they're huge numbers. They all begin with a T. 20 plus is what we've heard out until 2050. And that's largely because everything's going electric, and we're going to need 2 to 3 times the amount of power. However, by being smart about it, but with insight into the grid and with added flexibility, many investors and grid watchers, if you will, believe there can be some huge saves, not just in terms of the amount of investment, but also in the time. We can get there much earlier. So looking a little deeper into it, you can see that the amount of power that's going to go over the grid will triple over the next 25 years. But what's going to happen is we're going to more than double the amount of annual investment from around 300 billion today, or just slightly over a billion a day, to about 800 billion by 2030. Now, there are some big saves that are potentially there, and we'll get into those later today. But if we look at just, from the consumer standpoint, whether you're an industrial or an individual, renewable prices have been dropping dramatically. Storage prices are dropping dramatically, but our electricity bills are up. And, aside from what we saw over Ukraine, the network costs are going up, as you could see quite dramatically on the grid on the right side. So while we expect that wholesale energy costs to continue to drop as fossil becomes less and less of a component, the work to be done to reduce the cost of power is really going to be around the grid, and hence kind of what we're looking at today. And if we look at investments going forward, most of it is going to be actually in physical infrastructure. And we believe that there should be a lot more put into the world of intelligence and software, which we think very strongly that could save a huge amount in terms of CapEx going forward. And also ultimately reduce our energy costs, because we believe that the cheaper your cost of energy, the faster your economies can grow. And right now, Europe has got 2 to 3 times the cost of energy of the United States So, with that having been said, let me hand over to Louis to take us through a slightly deeper look into the sector for us. Thank you, Louis.
Yeah, thank you, Andre. So this is the way that we see the grid on a very simplistic level, and how we map some of the sort of emerging innovation sets across the grid. So on the left, there are technologies that are helping to manage, inspect, and get more out of the transmission distribution grid. To the right, where we'll spend today's session exploring, is how some technologies are optimizing the distributed energy resources and are providing the flexibility of the grid. And we're also seeing there's a group of horizontal technologies such as digital twins and cybersecurity. So within the grid flexibility space, we see 4 really interesting verticals appearing, each with very deep domain expertise. At the base, there are the battery storage assets, whether it be for residential, commercial use, who are providing the flexibility to the grid. And to optimize their revenue profile, they are using or interacting with a range of software solutions. A really interesting range of technologies appearing. When you've got the family of sort of battery storage assets at the bottom, who are all interacting and using some of these software solutions. So from resource management that are providing insights into conditions, to trading platforms that are leveraging AI to sell power into multiple markets and geographies, and then marketplaces that are matching the TSOs and DSOs with flexibility assets to expand liquidity. And as you can see, the landscape has really expanded over the last 2 years, the growing bench of use cases, some of which aren't even included here, but we've picked today's panel. As you can see that their technologies all are interacting together and form a key part of the flexibility value chain. Now, over the last 24 months, we've seen a broader range of investors entering the market beyond the traditional climate VCs who have been the cornerstone of this area for a while, with industry players such as ABB and Sony, and energy and grid players such as Total and EIP, as well as a growing bench of tech VCs, including software specialists such as Curtiu, General Catalyst, and Excel. And so what does that mean? I think we see a sort of continuation of a more appealing and a maturing asset class going forward. Now, we've mentioned some really exciting technologies and use cases, and AI is predominantly unlocking a lot of this innovation, but there remains quite a few structural issues that is slowing mass adoption. Integrating these solutions across multiple assets, markets, and jurisdictions is incredibly complex. We have over 2,500 DSOs in Europe, for instance. We have incredibly low utilization, and we have a huge backlog of battery storage assets that is slowing the electrification of some really exciting areas such as EVs, data centers, and industrial heat. But luckily, we have a leading panel we've got today who can provide some real-time insights into how the market is evolving and are addressing some of these challenges. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our panelists to do a quick introduction and presentation on themselves and their company. And so we'll start off with Jacob. So over to you, Jacob.
Thank you. Yeah, let me say a few quick words about us. I'm Jacob or Jakob. I'm one of the partners and founders of 2150. We're a venture firm out of Copenhagen and London. And we like to say that we invest in technologies that can enable a sustainable urbanization, meaning, creating prosperity for 2/3 of 10 billion people, which is sort of roughly the amount of people that are going to be living in urban environments by 2050. And if you go to the next page, there's a good reason why this is pretty critical, because cities, they essentially provide 80% of the GDP, so the biggest part of the prosperity pie, but they also drive a lot of the resource demand. So energy, CO2 emissions, 70%. A lot of the other resources and externalities that come from creating that prosperity platform are not extremely sustainable as we go to that scale of humanity. And so we think that's really focusing on the urban environment and urbanization as sort of like a vector is really important. And so looking for the choke points systemically on that path that will have to be solved, and we think technology will be part of that solution. And so we think that's a tremendous tailwind that basically captures population growth, technology, the climate, the energy cycle that we're looking into. So if we go to the next page, you can see a little bit of how we like to think about that systemic landscape in terms of a stack, just to remain in tech nomenclature. So if you disaggregate an urban environment, it consists of a lot of different interconnected parts. And one without the other doesn't really sort of get you to where you want to go. And so enabling technology is the stuff we actually built with, very heavy and dense on energy consumption. The way we operate it, which also includes obviously the energy systems and other inputs and outputs. And then ultimately it's is in order to create that experience, which is, you know, healthier, richer, you know, more fun, more enjoyable, more creative, that also then reproduces the economy and creates the creative destruction for the future of growth. So that's really how we look at it, and that takes us into a lot of different places, as you can imagine, where the energy system is a big part of it. If you go to the following page, you can see just like very briefly about our footprint. We invest half Europe, half the rest of the world. That's a lot of North America. We're investing out of a second fund, soon to be 500 million under management, Series A and early growth B investments typically. And so we have a couple of investments into the energy systems at different levels that we can talk about maybe in the following conversation. But that's us in a nutshell. I won't take more time, but just pass it on to the next panelist.
Thank you, Jacob. That's super interesting. I think up next is Juergen.
Yes. Thanks, Louis. Hi, Juergen. Greetings from Austria, from the biggest wine city in Austria, actually, where I'm sitting at the moment. My 5 kids run around behind me, so I hope you don't hear them. We are an optimizer of flexibility with a large focus on battery storage systems. And what's special about us, so I won't give you the sales pitch, but a little bit the background and the DNA of Enspired is that the founding team of Enspired is actually active since 20 years in the energy space. So I'm a trained software engineer. We were working in another company together where we brought an algo trading solution live end of 2014, beginning of 2015. So that was a big paradigm shift in how assets are treated in short-term power markets. So you can imagine before, traders sitting in front of 10 to 12 screens, and suddenly EPEX, the biggest power exchange in Europe for short-term markets, released an API. So things could be automated, right? This is where we licensed SaaS solutions in the old company to more than 40 of the biggest players, ranging from Iberdrola, Ørsted, Total Energies, Axpo, etc. So this is actually the background which resulted in an acquisition by Toronto Montreal Stock Exchange 2019. And with all that knowledge about how players are acting, what technology they use, and what's missing, we founded Enspired with a pretty simple idea. Higher renewable penetration needs more flexibility for successful integration, right? That will yield higher value of flexibility. Now you would all nod and say it's a no-brainer, right? The pitch was pretty tough 2019 because the spreads there were not 150 euros per megawatt hour, but 7 on average, right? So we started in a completely different market and kept pushing for the last mile, so milliseconds, everything automated, so we don't have any traders. We really use AI. It's not AI-based stuff on the website, right? So we have a separate innovation team led by my co-founder, Wolfgang. We work on reinforcement learning since 4 years. So we always dedicated resources for research. So even that we are actively trading on the market, you could consider us a software innovation house in that sense. And I want to show you how we think, right? In the past, we were among the first ones to provide that kind of algo trading solutions. And we continue with the DNA, right? So we were the first professional certified trader on EPEX Spot, a very new thing that we developed with them. We signed the first battery in Germany in mid of 2021, where the whole market told us nobody needs optimization of batteries, right? Then we introduced the cross-market optimization, where battery was not only used for frequency regulation. And nowadays people pitch like this was always the case, right? It was not, at least not 3 years ago. And then something happened. There was the energy crisis. Flexibility was really in demand and it was not there. And after that, this whole battery thing started on the continent. And then people realized that it's not a human experienced trader problem. It's a software problem, right? It's an optimization problem. And it's so damn complex that you can only solve it with technology, right? You can trade a gigawatt code block with humans, right? But you cannot trade a battery with a ton of warranty terms in real time in 3 different markets, 1 second frequency calls, 4 second ancillary services calls, 50-minute granularity wholesales for the future, and stay within the warranty terms and temperature limits, right? So I think there was a big paradigm shift that people realized, okay, now it's a tech game, right? It's not about human traders with experience, and there was no alternative, right? And so we kept on pushing. We published as a first one degradation-based optimization, so not only optimizing for revenue, but maximum revenue while reducing degradation. So we integrated a battery aging model in real time for our 8,000 to 10,000 optimization runs per asset per day. And then we found out that the market is lacking transparency, right? Everybody was throwing around with simulations and backtests, and this is how good my technology is. So we were the first one. I still argue globally, nobody ever showed me an alternative. We certified our optimization, so the real revenues we made for the asset owner by KPMG, and published them on our website. So you see what battery storages in Germany did last year on a monthly basis with a KPMG stamp, right? And we hope to push transparency for asset owners, for forecast providers, so that it's getting more tangible and there is more security in investing into these cases. And we even submitted then a patent for this kind of battery optimization. So you see, we have this first mover DNA. If you move to the next slide. So we're just in geo expansion. Several countries took assets live, Netherlands, signed Greece, etc., signed the biggest asset in Germany, 137 megawatts, signed the first 100 megawatt asset. And it's all based, it's my last sentence, it's all based scalability on data and technology with machine learning, right? And that was the big paradigm shift that you cannot compete with if you work in traditional asset optimization. Rest in the fireside chat.
Brilliant. Oh, listen, by the way, everyone, these slides will all be available post the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Juergen. Amazing what you've done in such a short period of time. I think up next is Jasper.
Thanks, Louis. Jasper here. Good morning from the US West Coast. Still pretty early here, still waking up, but I'll keep it short. So I'm Jasper, an investor with G2 Venture Partners. We've been investing in the space for a long time. I started 3 companies before I joined G2, and the first one was actually funded by Kleiner Perkins Green Growth Fund. So it's kind of where the story begins. John Durr started this fund in 2007, 2009, 8, and hired a guy called Ben Kortling, who made one of the very early investments at Goldman Sachs in First Solar, Sun Edison, Horizon Wind, and then basically start building out the Kleiner Perkins Green Growth Fund, which then spun out in 2017 to become G2. We've been investing in space for a long time, as said, really the first clean tech 1.0 phase with O-Power, Silver Spring, really the first flexibility assets, smart meters, we're part of that. And part of the current portfolio is 1.5, which I think we'll be talking about, which I think might be the one of the most advanced VPPs currently operating. So happy to come back to that, chat more about that. We growth stage fund, so we invest a little bit later than 2150, $15 to $50 million checks out of our current fund, which is about $500 million.
Thank you, Jasper. Super interesting. I think up next we have James on Picklo.
Hi everyone, I'm James. I'm the CEO, co-founder of Picklo. We're the world's leading independent grid flexibility marketplace. If you want to go to the next slide. So really our vision is to be the one-stop shop for all flexibility contracts globally. Think of this like an Amazon or an eBay, but for flexibility. You want to go to the next slide? So today, the discussion is all around Grid 2.0. Independent marketplaces like ours really are at the heart of the emerging Grid 2.0 value chain. And really, we play a role as a kind of critical interface between the ecosystem of sellers, whether these are the participants themselves or their technology vendors, and then the ecosystem of buyers, whether these are TSOs, DSOs, energy traders, utilities, ISOs, retailers, you name it, and of course their vendors as well. And really our model is not about displacing existing actors, but by unlocking more value and unlocking more outcomes. Just one more slide, if you want to. Yeah. So really, there's 3 things that marketplaces do. So first of all, providing transparency. The key purpose of a marketplace is to sort of signal where value lies, and especially in the emerging Grid 2.0 ecosystem, where value is complex to define, locational, temporal. Being able to signal where that is in a very transparent way is a critical point. The second piece is around liquidity, about pooling together as many of the buyers and sellers together into the same pool. Really, again, given the complexities of this space, having a whole series of liquidity islands, which is really the traditional way that these markets have been set up, especially around the grid services side of the market, is really unhelpful. So pooling this together into one shared pool of liquidity is key. And then the final point, as you can see in the slide here, it's all about a streamlined workflow. So again, the complexities that the systems that run the grid don't need to be directly exposed to the different commercial actors that want to participate. So translating grid congestion into revenue opportunities, for example, is a key requirement of the marketplace. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much, James. I think, and last but not least, we have Alberto.
Awesome. Nice meeting you, Alberto Méndez, co-founder and CEO at Plexigrid, where we are reinventing electricity grids for energy transition. We always say that there's no such thing as energy transition without a grid transition. And, today, if we look at this new flex ecosystem that is emerging, I like to talk about the flexibility iceberg. So most battery operators, aggregators, flex retailers are monetizing today just the tip of the iceberg. So they are operating typically in spot markets, daily, intradaily markets arbitrage, or on frequency markets for the transmission system operators. That accounts for 99% of the trading taking place today. However, under the water, you have a much bigger flex value to be captured that is not being addressed today, not because these players are not ready to engage, but because the distribution system operator on their side doesn't have the tools to engage up to today, and so a lot of the value is still unaddressed, which is a huge opportunity. In this slide, I go a little bit more in detail. I call this the onion, Grid 2.0 onion, if you will. At the core of the onion, you have if you think about fintech, let's talk about fintech, right? So the fintech revolution, I mean, the core banking systems at the banks are from the 1970s, 1980s, programming COBOL, and nobody dares to touch them because they work and so on. Then on the outer side of the onion, you have new players like, I don't know, Revolut or Swish or PayPal with much more modern dynamic stacks. But in the end of the day, you need to connect them all together. And that's when the value gets created, when you create the synapses. So, I mean, PayPal is useful when I can transfer money from my account to Louis' account. And for that, we need to go through the cranky systems, banking systems from the 80s. So what happens on the energy world is that in high voltage, those links have been formed. So that's why, we see the different parts of the onion interplaying, but mostly in markets like spot markets, frequency markets, and a little bit, I will say, the tip of the iceberg on markets like Nodes and Piclo. Nodes and Piclo can go 100x in liquidity the coming years if we do the right things. And that will be awesome for everybody. But what happens on distribution? Well, on distribution, they don't have real-time visibility of the physical infrastructure. So when you cannot see what's going on in your feeders, in your grid in real time, you don't know where, when, and why your bottlenecks are being formed. then the only thing you can do is to build everything for a peak, overbuild the infrastructure for a peak that happens just maybe 50, 100 hours a year, but the other 8,500 hours of the year, you're floating in overcapacity. It's tremendously inefficient. And here to the left, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but in transmission, which is already a flex system, utilization of capacity is 35%. In low voltage in distribution, utilization of capacity is below 10%. Huge. You have a 3-4x delta in efficiency, precisely because this distribution part of the grid is not intelligent. It's not creating an intelligent interplay with the other parts of the onion. And well, the flip side of that is capex. Out of this $1 billion a day invested in grid infrastructure, full 80% goes to distribution, only 20% to transmission, and simply mirroring this 4x, 5x in utilization of capacity. So imagine what will be possible if we establish a real-time synapses between the distribution grid, and if we lift efficiency from the current 8-9% to somewhere like 20-30%. We could save hundreds of billions of dollars, and it will mean that the flex value of the flex portfolios of battery operators or flex retailers like Octopus or Tiber will literally double. And for local flexibility markets like Piccolo, I think we will see a 10x in liquidity very soon and 100x in liquidity very soon, and a real game changer. And in the end of the day, the most important thing is the end consumer. We'll have much lower grid fees. 30 seconds left, I promise you. So this sounds like a science fiction, but it's already working. So this is Plexigrid identifying bottlenecks in low voltage. You can see the different streets here in real time. Now we're activating flexibility, and you can see that 80% of the bottlenecks are wiped out. There is a small bottleneck there in the center that will need an upgrade, as you can see, but in this case, we could reduce 70% of the plan upgrades, saving many millions of euros. That can be shared with the flexibility players and the end consumers instead of building at 8% efficiency. And the second example, I like it now that James is here, we're using our real-time digital twin to identify the bottlenecks and then automatically placing bids for flexibility on the local flexibility platforms. So super quickly. Now we see there's no problems on the grid, but later on in the evening, there will be problems. We will go above this red line of 1,000 kilowatts, which is the maximum capacity of the substation. And so the light blue line shows what happens if we do nothing. There will be a heavy overload, which is not okay. The dotted yellow line shows what happens if we activate all flexibility. So we see we have more than enough flexibility to solve the problem. And finally, last but not least, the dotted blue line is the optimal activation of flexibility. We just activate just as much as we need, no more, no less. And below you have the flex bids in the Piccolo platform, for example, and we just pick the cheapest. So the algorithms automatically choose the bids that resolve this congestion at the minimum cost for the grid operator. And last but not least, we can see here on the right the bids, and the acceptance, the proposed acceptance of bids that will resolve the congestion. That could be placed today semi-manually because they still want to approve manually. But in the future, I see all this trading happen fully electronically, automated. We're already doing it with some DSOs. Yeah, so hopefully you get a glimpse of how Grid 2.0 could look like.
Pretty cool stuff, Alberto.
Not far from today.
No, it's happening now. So amazing. And thank you all for that. Now, having done all that, I'd like to sort of get the discussion around the table and really talk a little bit about kind of where we are in the build out of flexibility, and then also get some insights and discussion going around, well, what happens with that increased build out and flexibility meets intelligence, meets trading, meets liquidity, meets, and where are we headed, so maybe if I could start, Jakob, you and I have talked about kind of the build out and storage in Europe. Also, I think Jasper, with your role in 1K5 or 1,5. So maybe if I could turn to you both first, maybe Jakob, to kick us off, kind of how do you view the build out and flexibility? Because that's the hard asset we need on which all this cool stuff can play, right? And so maybe just if you could share a couple of your thoughts, and then hand over to Jasper.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks. And great to see the live view, Alberto. We looked at this in the past, and it's so exciting. I mean, I think we're really looking at a super cycle of energy expansion, like the demand for energy, for electricity, driven by continued economic growth and electrification. I think it's just astounding. And we're at the very early beginning of it, right? We have a lot of renewable deployment, but that is going right into the sky in terms of capacity. And the electrification is going to really drive huge demand across all sectors of the economy. And, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening in the system. And clearly, the slow-moving piece is the regulated monopoly in the middle that has a difficult sort of like incentive, but also a very sort of like, heavy, archaic infrastructure to develop upon and to evolve. And so we have really, and I think also regulators have sort of like opened the opportunity space so that, that we can innovate around the edges. And I think that's been going on now for a while, right? So, and at the capillary system, if you will, you have the residential sort of like a piece of the land and in behind the meter of the household, to say, right? And this is where 1,5 has rolled out solar batteries, EV charging, heat pumps to hundred thousands of customers across Europe, and many other companies doing the same. And in order to aggregate that big landscape into like a big asset somehow to manage on the system, if we talk about flexibility markets, obviously that's a technology endeavor. So one thing is to put it all out there, but if you don't bring a well integrated stack of IoT, of connectivity, wiring, and controls and APIs to your system, so that you can sort of like do your software layer on top and build your like, let's say, cloud piece that allows you to manage this as a system that's greater than the sum of the parts, and that creates tremendous value for the consumer, for the company, for the grid, and for us as investors. I mean, that is a technology question. And then I think at the next level, what we're seeing now is coming very fast is then, of course, that we need to figure out how to balance the grid with more grid scale or sort of mid-level scale capacity, because of all the renewables that have been pushed into the system, and that's only growing. And this is where we are now looking as investors a lot into, like, what are the ways in which we can accelerate that battery deployment, and you really come back to, again, like figuring out like where sort of on the edges of the slow moving grid can you deploy capacity and manage that and make it sort of like create liquidity. And this is where all these different, this panel is amazing, because you have a lot of the constituent parts here of creating that liquidity, being able to trade the assets, being able to build the liquidity in the market. And then ultimately, I think what Alberto and his team is then also doing is to level up the distribution networks so that they can handle more of it. Because right now the scarce asset is really to find a good grid connection that has the capacity and put like something on that little let's say vein on the system, and that's hard to come by. And that's going to be, like, ultimately, I think, for a while, the constraining factor, because we got the cheap batteries, we got the smart people at Enspired and other companies that can trade it, and the capital really wants to go, but it's still early days. Liquidity is low, volatility is high, risk is a little bit so before we sort of get a little bit further, right, it's still like a little bit of a rocky road, and there's a bit of boom and bust. So I think, but it's a very exciting time, and I think we're very bullish, and we want to sort of like invest into different parts of that, both the technology and even maybe some of the asset deployment.
Brilliant, brilliant, Jakob. Thank you. And Jasper, how about from your perspective?
Yeah, I want to kind of zoom out and actually talk about what flexibility means and focus on residential, because I think there's sort of three parts to this, right? There's utility scale, there's C&I, and there's residential. And like flexibility at the end of the day is like a very vague term, right? So what does it actually mean? I think you really have to think about assets that are actually meaningful to the grid, right? Aggregate assets that are meaningful to the grid. And from a residential perspective, that's really a battery, right? That's sort of the core of it. So, obviously generation, solar, but then battery to actually provide flexibility, and maybe EVs, heat pumps, huge loads in the residential sector that you can basically steer, turn off, turn on at the right time, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that there was flexibility in the past. It's like turning off light switches or lights in the house, which are just not meaningful. I just think it's not that important and that relevant. So I think we're just getting now to the point where flexibility is really feasible, given battery technology has gotten so cheap, right? So I just looked at data, and in Germany we have about 1.7 million batteries deployed already, which is a reasonable size. I think like the Netherlands pretty far ahead there as well, and so on. So battery price, if you look at those over the last years, they just plummeted. So now we're really seeing like deployment of actual meaningful assets that can be steered, that can be provide flexibility to the grid on the residential side. And I think that's really exciting, to Jacob's point. Like I think it's just happening now, right? But a lot needs to happen to actually make that then be valuable to the grid and really provide flexibility. And 1.5 is really, kind of leading the charge here, I think, in terms of automating that, because it's very, very complex. Because you really need, as Jacob mentioned, you need to kind of build up the stack from bottoms up. So you need to be able to connect to those assets, which is non-trivial, because all these assets are built by different manufacturers. They don't have open APIs, right? So it's actually really difficult to connect to these assets and steer them. Then you need to basically do behind the meter optimization for the customer to make sure they basically use those assets in an optimal way for themselves. And then you need to optimize them against the grid. And all that requires very sophisticated software, takes a lot of time to build that and optimize that. And it requires the right regulatory framework, which I think is one of the biggest challenges, right? So you can't just do this behind the meter. You can, obviously, but that's only like, half the joy and half the value in all this. But it's like, how do you then provide flexibility and provide value to the customers? And I think that's kind of the sort of, where we are right now, and like making that possible. And unfortunately, that's DSO by DSO, country by country, it's different. The regulatory regimes are different. The smart meter rollout in Germany is a massive problem. It's just going so slowly and so painful. And so there are all these kind of constraints and challenges in actually making it happen, even though the technology now is getting there to make all that possible. And I think one of the things that's really important is and I wrote about this, deregulation of energy markets, giving access to all these, because we move into this world from like centralized production to basically then decentralized consumption. And now we're going into this very messy world where basically we're getting decentralized production and consumption, right? And so you really want to give consumers access to the wholesale energy markets to allow them to optimize their assets and basically get an ROI from their assets as well, and provide flexibility to the grid. And we're just not there yet. Like that is really happening country by country, and it's sort of a painful process for us to go through that.
Yeah, but brilliant. And as you say, the devil is in the details, and it differs from one region to the other. But I think fundamentally, as you add network capability and intelligence to, investable assets like flexibility, it makes it more attractive, at least hopefully. So, but with that thought in mind, maybe turn a little bit to, to Alberto, James, and to Juergen, each individually, in terms of, looking at the increasingly large pool of flexibility assets and how insight and intelligence, and then certainly from what you're doing at Plexigrid, and then also looking at marketplaces and trading with James and Juergen respectively. So maybe to start with you, Alberto, really this insight into the lower voltage grid. It looks like, we're penetrating into this massive world that's kind of undiscovered yet, but when you do, there's a huge amount you could do there. So maybe tell us a little bit more about what you're doing there.
Well, we're trying to. I mean, I like actually what Jacob mentioned before, that you know, in the value chain, everything is going great. Everything becomes faster, smarter, cheaper. You know, whether it is battery, solar, EVs, whatever. The only cost that is going on the opposite direction per kilowatt hour is the grid, and not surprisingly is the regulated monopoly part. So, you know, it was built for something completely different, for a system that was centralized, controllable, with very simple unidirectional power flows. And now the energy transition, all this innovation that is going around, is one by one exactly the opposite. And you know, what is driving the miracle is a combination of competitiveness and innovation. And what happens on this grid monopoly is that you don't have competitive pressure or drive to innovate. And so what we're trying to do is to, you know, supply to the and so of course what happens is that inevitably you become the bottleneck, right? The grid is the largest bottleneck of energy transition, the number one cause of delays and cancellations of renewable energy projects and electrification projects, the number one cause of curtailment. We are losing 15% of renewable energy in Europe because the grid is not well regulated and so on. So we're trying to solve that problem. We're trying to supply the part of the value chain that is most desperately in need of innovation, because it's bottlenecking everything else, you know, is the one that is receiving the least amount of innovation, because the super innovative guys, they don't want to work for the grid, you know. They want to work with e-mobility or with trading or with, you know, move to Octopus or, you know. And so, you know, somebody has to fix the grid part so that it can interplay with the other ones. That's what we're doing. And then we do the physics part, the real-time physics, but everything is prepared to meet markets. You know, when the magic happens is when physics meet markets. Well, James and I are working with some of the DSOs on bringing this together. Yeah, so markets only, you know, if you don't have visibility, then what happens? There's no liquidity because there's no demand side because the DSO is totally lost. But once you provide that, you know, then bang, then you can really change the world. That's what we're doing. And the last thing is that in this central part, I mean, I always say like this, that if you talk to an economist who in the 1980s who studied in Moscow and meets another economist who studied in Chicago, and they say, oh, great, we both studied economics, let's talk about economics. And they couldn't even understand each other because one studied 5-year plan economy. It was even forbidden to study market because that's evil. And the Chicago guys, the other way around, you know, they just study market. And maybe they studied one part of one subject of plan economy just to come to the conclusion that they shit and it never worked. But then came the Chinese and they blended two, you know, with, you know, Deng Xiaoping, and created the largest economic miracle in humanity. So as part of this, I think it's very, very important for investors that we address that, you know, we need to understand the grid guys. They are the Soviet Union's guys. They don't talk about markets. The DSO guys talk about 5-year plans, capacity plans, they're planners. And on the other hand, you know, the market guys, I don't think they understand the grid, you know, they're great traders, you know, but we need to, and it's like water and oil. But once you shake it up and mix the water and oil and mix it, then you will have a revolution. And that revolution was already accomplished in transmission. That's why transmission runs so efficient and so beautifully well. But so that's, you know, I think one part of that is the technology. And we're going to see the largest change in network technology in decades, similar to the revolution in telecom 30 years ago. But it has to come along with the largest deregulation or re-regulation of electricity networks in 100 years. And yeah, I finished with Bill Gates' quotation, you know, we don't need startup accelerators, we need regulator accelerators. Like the, you know, like the new EU Commission come with this plan for competitiveness and affordability and everything, you know, but they need help, you know. So I think we need to, you know, Europe risks falling totally behind US and China unless we don't put our shit together and re-regulate bold and quick and fast. So that piece, with this, I pass over to the others, but that piece is equally important as technology.
Alberto, if we have time for it, we'll talk about a European Doge, right? So anyway, James, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, all great points, Alberto and everyone else. It's so yeah, the exam question exactly is, you know, the critical path here is the grid. The exam question is how do we mobilize the change that we need faster? And I think there's two parts. It's like, yes, well, how do we get them doing things differently, or you know, and being comfortable and speeding up how they operate. I think you know, and the other part is the concept of confidence. I'll come back to that. But on speeding up, I think there's also one thing that we've learned is there's not just one regulatory body at play here. Procurement regulations, that's a big one. That has a huge influence on how innovative you can be, and how fast you can move. But like the utilities, you know, they're used to procuring things, you know, whether it's transformers or pencils for the organization. You know, when we started working with the utilities, they were thinking about buying flexibility in the exact same way. And of course it didn't work. So it was about, you know, slowly getting them to think, you know, how they can use digital platforms, not changing the process initially, just digitalizing the process of what they were doing, and then showing them the quick wins of like, well, actually, you don't need to do this bit, and you know, yeah. So I think there's you know, you have to, we can't sort of, we have to work with the grids. We have to work with the constraints, the regulatory, the you know, legislative constraints that they have, the business model constraints. But there's processes, and I think we've shown that you can actually make change. The other angle to this is the one about confidence. At the end of the day, keeping the lights on for folks is a big responsibility. You don't want the phone call from the president or the prime minister, because the major city has gone down. It's pretty high stakes working environment. Like, you know, this is why it's regulated to, you know, as well. So and they're not just going to you know, they love doing innovation projects, you know, because they're harmless, and you know, worst thing that goes wrong is a bit of simulation or you know, whatever. But like, if you at scale deploy an innovation, I mean, the lights go off at scale. That's the risk that's holding people back. And the thing that is needed is confidence. And what drives confidence is data on things working and data-driven decision making. And I think, you know, again, we're now starting to see, as we're scaling up in our deployments, more and more data about how this is actually happening, and you know, how reliable is flexibility or different providers, and how do you factor that into whether you make a critical national infrastructure decision or not. So I think there's a lot more that, you know, and I know that when we talk to regulators, the thing that they're crying out for is more data, because there's a dearth of data in this sector. There's a lot of models and consultants' reports, but in terms of raw data of what things going on, it's actually quite we're quite data poor. So yeah, I think using data is really a central point to sort of build confidence and you know, encourage and faster change in these organizations.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. And you know, coming over to you, Juergen, I guess the question, if I recharacterize it slightly, is with your trading technology, are you seeing big results at your customer end? And you know, because I think you're already starting to see quite a bit there. So
Yes.
it'd be lovely to hear about that.
Yeah, we think in the segments that Jasper said before. So we look at grid scale assets, CNI scale, and residential, and we're coming from the other side now. We decided to go for grid scale. Why? Because I think what we have not discussed yet is the time, right? It's not that the energy transition is waiting for us or is waiting for regulation or for DSOs to change. So we have more than 850 megawatts of grid scale batteries under management within 3 years now in 5 countries. I think that will be, and it's 100% available to the grid, right? When we say grid scale, their job is 100% ancillaries, wholesales, you name it. What we've seen, we have some CNI scale behind the meter projects. What we see there is that the initial thought of an asset owner is to optimize themselves first. And then the cherry on the cake is helping the grid, right? We see the same with residential, and I think that's the big problem. I totally liked what Alberto shows, what Piclo is doing. But I think if we want to fundamentally help the grid operators, I think the asset sizing needs to change, because currently, I exaggerate now, please jump in, guys. But I have PV plus battery storage plus charging at home, and the battery is sized to maximize my PV own consumption. What means you can roll out gigawatts of residential batteries. They will just not be available for the grid when they matter the most, because then they're busy with my own PV and I'm still feeding into the grid. So what I'm doing, I mounted the PV and I reduce my impact, but I still increase the peak, right? And then I'm slowly discharging over the next hours, and I'm not discharging at the late peak, right? To replace conventionals. I'm optimizing myself first. And if there is some stuff left, I'm available during the night, which is of low urgency, right? That's different with grid scale. I don't say we're not getting there. We've just taken the decision, how do you scale fast? And our decision was with grid scale, and scale fast in terms of flexibility available to the market. And what Plexigrid does, I wonder why your DSOs not take your software, and what we miss clearly regulatory wise is a localized incentive, right? You showed these points, and why does a DSO not just build a 1 megawatt battery there instead of marketplaces and complex products and manual acceptance? Just take 1 megawatt that's the solution, right? So that could go on, but that's our view, right? The technology, just to be aware, for what we do for optimization is exactly the same for 100 megawatt asset like for a 5 kilowatt hour asset.
Right.
So that's not the problem. The problem is that you have double grid fees. In Austria, you have different grid fees per grid level, per county, per whatever, right? So the business case is just crap in a lot of countries compared to grid scale, right? Because the regulation has further evolved. But the topics are the same. Is it grid supporting? And I think we can learn a lot from the TSO level that will convince or be transported to DSOs, because currently in Germany, 830 DSOs are making up their mind where to build, what's grid friendly, what's grid supportive, what's the difference, right? And I think if the TSOs set the standard and say, hey guys, we have a solution, please adopt it, then we can achieve harmonization, and then everything you have told will flourish, right? But it's
so you could
maybe just a comment. I think this is so important. I just wanted to make a comment that, I mean, try to imagine that if every household would like dig their own well to pull up water from the ground, would like burn. I mean, think about, like, there's no other modern industry where we have avoided economies of scale, sort of like centralized economy of scale of production and distribution. But somehow, because of this bloody grid and everything that Alberto is explaining, like, we have to kind of like move on the edges and try to do what's feasible. Because you just like you get stuck when you get to the distribution at the lower levels of the grid, and it's just so insane if you think about it in a sort of like bigger picture, compare it to other things. There's still so much value, but the sad thing is that it creates almost like this tragedy of the commons where, you know, Juergen is optimizing his own household, he's getting a good deal, but then like he pays less grid fees, the average grid fee for the rest of us go up. The incentives, the economics for the grid operator to invest goes down, and then so you kind of like everyone sort of like disconnects from the grid, and like who's left holding the bag, right? And how do we get this upgrade going? And this is where I think regulators have to be really careful that they don't miss this dynamic, that you basically starve the grids before we get them up to speed. So and that is that creates some that requires some regulatory let's say guts and conviction.
Well, if I can jump in, because I think this is really exciting. There is this mathematical theorem that proves that any asset connected to a network increases its value. Of course, that is based on the hypothesis that you have a functional grid, not a dysfunctional grid. And so, that's the kind of thing. And I mean, to go off grid for the very privileged, who has a villa, who can put rooftop solar and batteries and heat pump. And well, in Northern Europe, you need a gigantic battery to make it through 3 or 4 weeks of where it's dark, like Mordor, and you don't see the sun, and you need to power your heat pump, and it's cold like hell. And once you have this gigantic amount of batteries, if you can buy them, right? And I know 2 guys who do, but we're talking hundreds of thousands of euros just for the fun of it, because they are rich. But then you want to have that battery connected to the grid the rest of the year to monetize it, right? Because you use it in full 4 weeks, but how about the rest? And so, but we need to do the grid from dysfunctional to functional in distribution. I think that's the key on my point here. And I get it there. Maybe James, what do you think?
Well, I think I've got a new solution here. Like I think we can table. We got to do something with the regulators, and things need to move faster. Let's I think we're all in agreement, violent agreement on that. What a different solution is, well, is there more we can take into our own hands to change things? And I'll give a good example, Juergen, in California, where we just launched this year. We launched the first seller-led marketplace. So Sunrun, who big residential storage and solar aggregator in California, have a number of what they call batteries in the wild. The houses are sort of self-optimizing, and they're not sort of controlling, and that's suboptimal in terms of actually the income that these households could be taking, as well as for the grid. So what we've done with Sunrun is they've gone and listed the potential capacity they have available in different parts of California on our open marketplace, and now buyers, whether these are grid companies or retailers, are coming to the marketplace and going, well, actually, I can use that's useful. And I think it's a really interesting way of, like, by taking power in your own hands, like just by changing the fundamental dynamics of some of these markets, where sellers are more like, or the non-regulated parts of the industry who are more innovative and able to move faster, and can do some stuff that then lead the industry, and then we bring the regulated pieces along the journey. So I think it's like there's more I'm sure there's more we can do, as well as waiting for governments and regulators to sort of have the aha moment as well.
Can I ask a question, James? So is it the residential flexibility, or would you say I sacrifice my own consumption case and offer it to the market?
So this case is residential, but I mean we're growing all sorts of different asset classes into the platform. So it's agnostic,
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, one thing, Juergen, to reflect on, just I would like to provide you a couple of examples that we see every single day in Southern Europe, which is 4 p.m. A lot of curtailment already happening in Germany, right? I mean, Germany has in rooftop solar 30% curtailment, right? 30% of renewable energy thrown to the garbage every day. And why is that? Because people are still in the office. The rooftop solar is full throttle, very little local consumption. So voltage goes up. So you have over voltages. And at 254 volts or something, the inverters of the solar panels just trigger to avoid blasting the grid. And then you have curtailment. Okay, you're cut off the grid. But at the same time, in the same feeder, in the same bloody street, you have EVs, you have air cons that could be pretty cool in these houses, with curtailed power that is being thrown away, but they are stopped. You know why? Because the grid has decided that that's peak time and it's too expensive for them to charge. So you have, the cost of the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing. Every day we're throwing away terawatt hours of I mean, maybe if we put a lot of batteries, we can solve all of that. But today we don't have those batteries, and every day we don't solve these synapses. You know, we're just building a complete inefficient system. You know, very wasteful, very capex intensive. Yeah.
But I think
But it-
Alberto, just jumping in here for a second, sorry, but by by being plugged to a network, that the profitability or the utilization of the batteries is going to actually expand, and understanding you're trying to do it at the residential level, which is much more difficult, but it's all about data and aggregating it, right? But
Yeah.
that's a huge pool, and I see you guys are right in the crosshairs for that. I mean, so I think if you could show to banks the bankability or the increased revenue potential by being plugged into the network, I think it's a massive
Yeah.
market.
And the capital community has to put pressure on the DSOs, you know. So these DSOs are consuming capital, both equity and debt capital, with very inefficient. So a key here is that with capital deployment, you know, needs to come efficiency requirements, you know, and that's important. Also, I mean, you ask why DSOs don't take our system, but I mean, we work with 25 DSOs, so we have gone 10x in revenue since last year. So they're moving now. They're starting to move. That's really good news. Also for James and I, we see, you know, things accelerating finally. So that's really good, and I think it will snowball very quickly. But the one obstacle is that, and this is very important to understand, remuneration of grid operators. You know, because they are regulated monopolies, they're regulated with cost plus schemes. So all my infrastructure cost, disregarding the efficiency, plus a regulated profit, I can pass on to the end consumer. So I have no incentive, in a sense. The more copper, the more I dig, the more infrastructure I put on the ground, the more inefficient I am, the more EBITDA I make, the more profit I make. And that's what, if we change that, we will see a change of behavior and vice versa. This is what needs to be now made super clear to the Commission in this grid reform they want to do, that your current cost plus scheme rewards inefficiency. So if you want to obtain efficiency, you need to reward, you know, you need to put a system that gives more profit to those grid operators that can distribute more kilowatt hours with less assets, because they use more flexibility. And that's where, you know, we'll create a massive pool for flexibility on those markets and change behaviors. So, I mean, I had the most cynical discussions with DSOs and say, we don't get remunerated that. If we get paid for cables, we build cables. So part of the low efficiency is that reinforcements that were not needed were made because they were legal and they were profitable, and because, you know, going less capital intensive. So I think this is the number one thing. Change the incentivization, change the incentive system for DSOs, and you will see a 180-degree change in behaviors. From
Yeah, Alberto, maybe a provocative question here for everybody is that by starting to be successful outside, you know, and with, you know, flexibility assets, and starting to show that more efficient use of it, because as you say, the grid is just going to build more capacity when actually it probably doesn't need it, because we're not utilizing it properly, right? So they're incentivizing correctly, but by trying to talk them into changing a regulation, it could be sort of, you know, could take too long. But by showing a different model, which I think you all are starting to do, which is one that, you know, does more with less, right? And I'm wondering if you kind of lead the grid by example. I'm just wondering, is that, you know, too wishful thinking? And I open that up to everyone on the call.
No, it isn't. I mean, just a few months ago, Germany, you know, which were lagging behind 10 years before the rest, they just passed through Parliament Energiewende 14A. And that's a piece of regulation, but it's very simple. And basically it says, if you have a heat pump or an EV or a flexible asset that can be controlled, you can connect it to the grid in a special regime where on one hand, you get 70% discount on your grid fees. And the grid fees, I repeat, are the single largest component on the electricity bill for Germans, domestic consumers. You get a 70% rebate on grid fees in exchange for you connecting this heat pump to the grid control system and accepting that they will reschedule your heat pump up to 2 hours a day, if and when they have congestions. And at that price point, a 70% discount, these flex grid tariffs leave the same profit for E.ON as the traditional tariff, because it's basically all profit, you know. They don't need to deploy capacity for the flex connections because they can unilaterally reschedule them when, if and when they have congestions, which is 8% of the time. So it's all about making sure that all this heating, all this charging takes time in the 92% unutilized capacity. That's the thing, and it's a massive win-win. And now you know, so things like this, you know, this will create a massive revolution in Germany now. They get the DSOs get 5 years now to implement, because first they need to roll out the smart meters to make this work technologically. So, but you know, I think Germany has been bold and done the right thing. We pass it through Parliament. We give you 5 years and just do it. You know, and movements like this, I think, can make big changes and so on. And I mean, there's a lot of things that they could have done better.
Years.
Yeah,
it's 2030 in 5 years, right, before it comes into. So I don't know if that satisfies our climate goals, right? To be honest, that's what
Alberto,
I
have a question. Maybe you can you can answer this. I mean, what I hear from people who are trying to scale VPP in Germany is that less or maximum 1% of the smart meters that are already out there in Germany, which is already very low, but that's only 1% or less of them are actually smart. Because so meaning you can do dynamic tariffs, because the DSOs do not have the systems, or maybe not the processes to actually, you know, register them properly, balance them, put them into the balancing pools, and so on. So is that real, and is that a bottleneck, invisible bottleneck?
That's real, and in that sense, it's only UK and Germany that is so far behind. And I know 5 years is a long time, but what I like of Energiewende 14A is that in Sweden, in Norway, in Denmark, in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, I mean, Europe has deployed 220 million smart meters already. So those guys, if they pass something like this now, they can be online in 1 or 2 years, because they already have the smart meters. That's what is the really exposing thing. And I think we should give some points to Germany for, you know, providing the idea. And actually was the DSOs, right? There is a lot of things that, I mean, our view is that this kind of tariff, this kind of thing needs to be done through a flexibility market, not like they have done it in Germany, like through Piclo or nodes or whatever market they choose, and that it should be voluntary, whereas the German law is compulsory. But I think you will get a 95% adoption voluntary and nobody complains, you know, because you have two alternatives. I mean, there are a few things that I will have tweaked, and especially that it goes through local flexibility markets and through aggregators, which is much better for end consumer experience and everything. But you know, there are some ideas already, wild ideas coming from the old DSO. So, you know, I think we're going to see an explosion. But now Germany is true, 1%, and they want to, I mean, Germany wants to catch up. They're 20 years behind, and they want to catch up 20 years delay in 5 years. So it's going to be a mess, but it's going to be, you know, like a very creative mess.
Is there actually like a penalty if they don't deliver the smart meter on time to the customer, if it doesn't work as it should, etc.?
There is sadly not super hard penalties, so it could take 6 or 7 years. We have seen it before, but again, you know, all the value of this is that all the other DSOs that already have smart meters say, shit, we could put it like this and deploy it next year, right? And that's you know.
But you're talking about timelines. You're talking about timelines. I just heard that the biggest bottleneck, obviously, in Germany and Europe is like for utility scale storage to get access to the grid is substations and specific transformers, and that backlog is just as long as getting smart meters installed in Germany. It sounds like.
It's huge.
To be honest, guys. Yeah, to be honest, I think that there's a lot of. It's a big mess, right? Communicating 200 gigawatts of whatever, because in reality, there is way below 10% accepted anyways, right? It's like you go to a developer, everybody will tell you at least a gigawatt of pipeline, and then they build 100 megawatts, right? So I think that the grid applications have never been that high, but this will not translate into real capacity, right? And what's happening now is, I think it's very large driven by pure battery developers. And trust me, there is a lot of renewable players that have land, that have permits. There is no grid-scale PV plant without co-located batteries in Germany. So I think there is other routes than just the big grid-scale players, and the big ones, they have secured the grid access and the permits. But I fully agree. But I still think that grid-scale will be 5 times faster in terms of available flexibility to the market than residential, right? If we hear that regulatory stuff, grid fees are still then not really solved. I mean, the smartest thing, Alberto, I think, was NEBEF in France, because flex aggregation works since years there with a compensation payment organized via RTE. Even on the household side, hundreds of megawatts of electric heaters have been aggregated there years ago already, right? And it worked. So I think it's not an invention by the Germans. UK is live with the wholesale stuff since November. So there is some markets moving there. But the question is how much of flexibility is really available. It's super nice to say I aggregate 100,000 heat pumps, but what is left to support the grid, right? We're talking grid 2.0 here, and not about commercial optimization. From commercial optimization, I take every residual flex and make money out of it. But to support the grid, I have to have this overcapacity, right?
Yeah, and Juergen, to your point, it's really important that it's all joined up. So, the flexibility asset build out is aware of what liquidity can do, which what you're providing, or what James is providing, or their insight that Alberto is bringing to the table. So that's super important, and I think it's our view is that by continuing the good work and advancement that you guys are all on this call are doing, is you lead by example, right? And then hopefully we can drag some of the grid with us, right? Because the problems are getting, as you said, the build out in renewable energy assets is outstripping everything else. So the issue around negative prices, curtailment is getting bigger and bigger every day. So I think we're coming up against the time. I think this has been really, really insightful for us, and I'm sure everyone who's been dialed in, and there's been a really large number of people who have. So I wanted to thank everybody, Jakob and James and Jasper and Juergen and Alberto. Thank you for all your input, the time. This has been very, very stimulating, and it's really uniquely beneficial, I think, to get you all together on the same call. So thank you all.
Thank you for putting this together. It was really good.